welcome back to Making Records with Eric Valentine. That's me. At the beginning of this, I'm just going to walk around a little bit and you can see what's happening here. It's in process. I'm trying to make the control room not look insane. And so this is what's going on. You can see all these tubes are getting covered with fabric. They're coming out pretty sweet. I think they look good, you know, nice, clean, solid look there. And I got the first framed stretched fabric thing that covers up the VPR panels. So there's that. I think those are coming out pretty sweet too. You know, this one will be covered up. These two will be covered up. Those two will be covered up. This pair will be covered up there. It's in process. I'll probably do a whole video that has more of this in detail, but here's an assembly table here. This is a bunch of the sidewalls. We actually, once we got the first one up, then we were able to do it more assembly line, which is unquestionably faster. We did all of these, and all these just have to get formed into the actual boxes. And then in the front of the room, you can see the tubes are pulled out right now that were in the front of the room here. And so this TV has finally gotten mounted properly. And there's going to be two more screens, one up here and one there. Hopefully, you know, I haven't actually heard it with those screens in place, but you can kind of see back there what's going on. All that is getting finished up. You know, obviously we'll pull the screen out and tuck the tubes back in there once we're ready for that. But that's where it's at. I think this week, this room will look done-ish, I think. I did one last experiment. I couldn't help myself. I had to do it. There'll be an episode about it because I want to show graphs and the whole thing. It was fruitful. I got this one, just the last little bit I was able to pin down. And so I'll tell you about all that. It's actually a lot of this question about VPR versus tubes. So finally, I just needed to answer that for myself so I could just be done with this and move on with my life. So, okay, but now I'm going to put the camera on a stand. I'm going to try and answer a bunch of questions. All right, here we go. All right, so I'm sitting down. I got a list. I marked exactly where I left off with questions before, and I just feel like this is a good time for me to try and just get caught up with this, because these questions, I definitely got behind, and so the process is a lot further along than the questions, and so I want to just get through all these, get caught up with the questions, and then we'll all be sort of up in the same place in this timeline, and then I'll do an episode about doing all this stuff, the final experiment that I did, and show you sort of, you know, yet another final result. So here we go. So this is back from episode 24. So we're pretty far back. So username Soulflower asked, what is the thickness of the sheet metal that you used versus the German sheets? So the German ones were specified with 1 millimeter thickness, and so I ended up using 20 gauge steel, which is 0.911 millimeters. So that's where I ended up for the main ones. So yeah, so these ones right here, which are, I believe, 3 feet by 4 feet in dimension. And so then there's a smaller one. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a smaller one up there. And so I went to a thinner metal for the smaller one. So the idea being that really what determines the resonance of the metal is the flexibility of it. So the stiffer it is, the higher the resonance is going to be. The more flexible it is, the lower the resonance is going to be. And that gets affected by a bunch of different things. So the size of the sheet combined with the thickness of the material and the shape will all sort of affect that. So so, you know, I did a bunch of testing, trying to find exactly where the resonance would be of things, but it turned out that it was a lot more broadband than that. And so, you know, thinner material sort of leans it more lower, and thicker material will lean it a little bit higher, but it's pretty broad in how it resonates and how it ultimately affects the absorption. So, so yeah, so it's not that fussy of a thing. You don't have to be that precise with it. But I use 20 gauge, and it's very close to 1 millimeter. So there it is. Okay, so then Angelo Baltini asked,
let's see. There is a second null happening slightly higher, which is comb filtering with the floor reflection. You can prove that by dragging the measurement mic back. The further back the mic is, the higher and deeper the null will be. I'm still unsure how to tackle this problem. So in this question, it started by saying that they had speakers set up in a room. They were getting that sort of 100 hertz cancellation, which is this SBIR effect, and then a secondary one that was happening off the floor. And so I had a similar thing here, and I definitely had a result. Hold on. Okay, Max, relax. There might be people showing up to help finish this barn today. And so I had a result with that. I'm going to save it for the episode where I can really go into detail and really show the results. But yes, I did address that. Not surprisingly, it's kind of an insane approach. I don't know that it would work for everybody, but it definitely made a difference for me. The graphs were undeniable, and just the experience sitting here was great, and it has a huge effect on how much EQ I need to do. I've managed to reduce the amount of EQ that I need to do quite a bit. So in this room, it's like this close to a point where I don't think I would have to EQ it. It's really pretty much there. So, but still, I like a lot of low end, so there's that. But yeah, it'll make more sense to do that when I can really show the whole thing in detail. Okay, so then there's username you, who, me. Newbie question. I have an SSL 12 interface. I want to use a Golden Age 1073 preamp, which I can connect to the SSL, but the SSL has preamps. So it would be a preamp into the SSL 12 preamp. Is that crazy, or what people do? Well, I took a quick peek at the SSL 12 interface. They describe the input as having a wide range of gain settings, and so I'm pretty sure what that means, and just glancing at it, it appears you can plug line level signals into those same inputs. It might be similar to the UA interfaces, where if you use an actual XLR, Canon connector, that would be the mic input. And if you use a TRS, it has one of those dual jacks on there, then that would be the line level input. So you could experiment with that. But to your question about, is that crazy? It's not crazy. And I plug preamps into preamps all the time. I'm doing it a lot recently because of this RCA console that I've fallen in love with. It's an amazing sounding console, but the preamp is so insane. It's basically on with 40 dB of gain, and there's no adjustment. There's just 40 dB of gain, and the way they had it set up was there was an attenuator after it, and so you could blend, how much level was going to the summing, passive summing matrix, but there's no way to change the gain in the preamp. You can't. There's no adjustment for it. So, and so I use it a lot with ribbon mics, and if I'm using it with a rhythm mic and playing like a soft acoustic guitar part or something, I definitely need more than 40 dB of gain, and so. Initially, I was trying cloud lifters, but those don't work with these preamps for some reason. There's a weird interaction. I tried for a couple days to figure out, why is this happening? Is there a way I can make this not happen? I'd love to use cloud lifters with these preamps, but I couldn't resolve it. There's some interaction there that's the cloud lifters doesn't like, and the more gain I would add with the cloud lifter, the more it would introduce this low pass filter roll off on everything. It's just crazy. Didn't work. But what did work is using just another mic preamp. In my case, it's a Undertone Audio, MPDI4, before the input of the mic input of the RCA. And so I would add a bunch of gain with the MPDI4 and then put a pad on the output of the MPDI4. And that would reduce the noise from that gain stage. And so I could get the noise floor way down with a lot of extra gain. And so, what I would do is put like maybe a 20 to 30 dB pad on there. So if I put, let's say it's a 20 dB pad, but set the input gain at 40, then I'm adding 20 dB of gain before the RCA console. The total gain then is like 60 dB. So I can actually get some really high gain settings going into the RCA, and it's worked great. It works wonderful. So people do that. Maybe it is insane, but I do it, but I am insane. So there you go. Okay, so then username Rico Gauthier. Okay, hopefully I got that name pronunciation right. Hi, Eric, I remember you saying that you would cover all the walls with tube traps. What is the reason that made you change your mind? Well, it was this whole journey. I was, the tube traps definitely, the tube traps had always been very effective for me in the past, and I would say my only issue with them is that they're a little bit bulky. I would say less bulky than just using, stacks of mineral wool, which is what I did in my previous studio. They seem to be more efficient than that, but I was really excited to try these VPR things. This was potentially a way to get, the same amount of absorption down into low frequencies with a depth of only like 6 or 7 inches, which is really impressive. And so I did the VPR thing, and then, got them all up, and then my room wasn't flat. And so I had to do something. And so I reintroduced the tubes, and the tubes are the thing that ultimately got there. And so my last experiment really addresses tubes versus VPR, and those results will be coming up soon, and I can share in more detail. But that was really the journey. I think, my initial plan was to use all tubes. I heard about the VPR thing from Jürgen Strauss, really wanted to do that. I did it. And then, I went tube crazy again. Okay. So then there's another one here. This is username AntCall. It says, is there a reason foam is used instead of rock wool? Have you thought of making a panel that is rock wool with the sheet metal, or a panel with rock wool foam or sheet metal? Thanks, Eric. I'm guessing that rock wool could do what you need it to do acoustically. I think just physically getting it to work would be a little more difficult. The thing that really is great about the melamine foam is how stiff it is and how well it holds its form. It makes it way, way easier to work with. I was able to just put 2 bolts in the wall. I used a core cutting drill bit to cut holes in the foam, and you just go whoop, set it on top of the bolts, and it holds itself in place perfectly straight. And also when it's cut professionally, like the face of it is, a really, really precise flat surface. And part of the VPR thing, as I understand it, is that you have this resonant metal panel, and you want to get it as close to the foam as you can without it touching. And if you have this really irregular surface, like mineral wool would potentially be, it would be a little more difficult, first of all, to just hang the stuff in place, because you couldn't just put it on a couple bolts. And those same bolts, by the way, hold up the metal panel. So you just put in 2 bolts and it holds everything together. And so, the irregular surface and just sort of, soft droopiness of the mineral wool would make it more difficult to just get the precision of that sandwich to happen. Having a piece of metal sandwiched in between 2 layers of this soft absorptive material and not have it touch, So that's the only potential drawback that I see, but I think acoustically it would probably do a very similar thing. Okay, so then I have... Okay, I'm just going to apologize in advance about pronunciation here. So this is Tahomir Verbanik. I hope I got that right. Hey, Eric, maybe I didn't catch it in the video. Did you make a room measurement with all panels installed? So you can see that in both episodes 26 and 27. I show that graph and show how much my room was not done. I mean, there were 3 massive cancellations in my listening position in the room. I wish that wasn't the case. I was really expecting it to not be that. My initial test with it when I just had, one panel with a speaker in front of it, and I added the metal and sort of constructed the VPR thing, it really made a huge difference. It was like a 9 dB difference in the amount it was reducing the cancellation that was happening, this SBIR type cancellation. I was really thinking, wow, this is going to do it. But once I put all these panels on the ceiling and all these panels and all the walls all around me, I still had like a 15 dB cancellation at 50 hertz, It's unusable. So I had to do something. Tubes to the rescue. Okay, yeah, here it is, okay. I think, I put it in here. This is, let me see. I'm gonna blow this up so you can just see this really quick. Here is the graph. I actually embedded it in the document here. Here's the 15 dB, at least, cancellation at 50 hertz. Another massive, this is probably at least 10 dB cancellation at 100. And here's another one at 200. That's what I was dealing with in here. So, it didn't work. But that is what it looked like. Okay, so then Eric Frisson asked, can you tell us why you didn't include glass windows between your control room and live rooms? Won't video screens provide the same amount of reflective surface in your control room? And then there's a bonus question. So I will answer this part first. So you're totally right. Flat screen TV is a hard reflective surface, just like a glass window. It will affect the room acoustically the same way. And so I feel like that's sort of a wash. They end up doing sort of the same thing. But here's the two things that tip the scale for me. So I did this even in my last studio where I only had one sound room in front of me, but it was a big, wide room. And if I put a glass window, I can only see a very small portion of the room, and really just didn't do the job. I was going to have to put cameras up anyways to see a drummer that's all the way in the corner near the chamber underneath the drumbrella that was set up, in Barefoot. And so it really didn't get me there. I was still faced with the possibility of having to put cameras all over the place and have screens and a window. And so way back then, in 2000, when I set up at Barefoot, that was really when I made the change and just decided, screw it. Windows just aren't going to get me there. I'd much rather have cameras and screens. I can see everything that I need to see way better. It's, adjustable. I can have cameras that I can move around. This place, I've gone all the way there. And it's really important here because there's a big room behind me. This is the main recording space, is the opposite direction. The opposite direction that I'm facing. And then there's another sound room on the other side of this wall. So there's really no way to do it with glass where I would actually be able to see everything that I need to see. So I much, much, much prefer screens. And so here's the other thing, is that, so the speakers that I'm using, they're probably a couple feet out from the wall. Even when I back them all the way up to the wall, they're pretty deep. They're large speakers. And so that ends up creating sort of like a void between the speakers. And if I had a window that I have to look through, then I can't put bass trapping along the front wall. And it's one of the most important places to do it. And if I have a screen, I can have the screen just in front of all of these tube traps that are dealing with the acoustics of the front of the room, which is really where the tubes make the most difference. 90% of the benefit you get comes from tubes in the front half of the room. And so if I have a window there, then I can't do that. And that was another deal breaker for me with the window. But it's a good question. I miss out on having that more sort of direct visual connection with artists. But, I found when I had a window, they very rarely ended up in that place where I could, have the benefit of it. So I gave up on it. Okay, bonus question. Do you still have the masters for Persephone's Bees album? There are some incredible tones on that album. Would love to hear a mix breakdown. I do. And so, yeah, I recently retransferred all of the masters. So I have the original Pro Tools sessions that I worked from, and then I retransferred the analog masters after, right before I left Barefoot. Is I think that was one of the first episodes I did in this whole transition to Vermont thing. So I would love to do an episode about Persephone's Bees. It's certainly a way, way lesser known project that I was involved with, but that was a band that I just discovered on my own, fell in love with them. I just saw them playing in the corner of a small bar in San Francisco. I was just like, holy shit, what is this? They were so cool. And just decided, I'm just gonna make a record. Let's just do it, And ultimately ended up, they got signed to Columbia Records and, put out a record and all that stuff. But some bands explode and blow up and do amazing, and some don't, and that one just didn't happen to connect at the time. So, it's become like a cool little secret for the people that discovered it. But yeah, that's the kind of project where, we were really free to do whatever we want, because when we recorded it, there was no record company involved, and it was totally up to our own whim. Like, what do we want to do, And so there was a lot of really fun experimentation and really taking time to get cool, chase sounds and just geek out and do stuff. And they were super game for it and super talented and really fun. And, it was a really, really great experience. And the guitar player, Tom, he's just an amazing musician, and so he's been involved in other stuff. I've brought him in to play guitar and stuff. So he played guitar on Grace's Daylight record and a bunch of stuff. So he's still around in my life. I do get to chat with Angelina occasionally, here and there. She's awesome, still out there doing stuff. So, but yeah, I would love to do that. Okay, so then Jose Alberto is the username. Have you looked into PSI Audio active bass traps? They seem interesting. I've answered this before, I believe, but it takes only a second to answer it again. Yes, I tried it. It did nothing in my room. And so I sent it back. I would have been delighted to have that fix all of my problems. Just put one of those in each corner, as expensive as they are, would have been amazing. It would have saved me so much, drama and complications with things. But man, it did nothing measurable in my room. Maybe I didn't use it right, maybe whatever, I don't know, but boy, it did not work. Okay. So Greg Edenfield asked, did you re-glue the metal sheets to the foam before hanging? Did you use green glue to do so? I did not. I will be plagued the rest of my life if that was a mistake or not. My instincts tell me that I don't think that is a deal breaker for those things. Gravity sort of holds everything together. There's a sheet of absorptive material that's facing the floor, and then the metal's on top of that, and then there's another layer. It's a sandwich again, and so the top layer of absorptive material is sitting on top of it and definitely making contact with it. My guess is that they glue it to try and keep the metal, centered inside there, so it doesn't end up making contact with the metal cage around it. But I would be surprised if that is really essential for the performance of the acoustic absorbing properties. Could be wrong, but I did not glue them. I did make sure that they were recentered in there. As we put them up, I would check to make sure that it was centered in there, and then finalized it. So hopefully gravity will do the trick. Okay, so then a question, Dave Stanley asked, based on this, it would seem that literally placing a sheet of steel against regular insulation against the wall would dramatically help. Why do they even need to be in panels? Okay, not totally clear about what's being asked here, but probably some version of what you're stating here, I think, is probably true. Against a sheet of against regular insulation against the wall. Oh, like if you just leaned it up against the wall, why do they even need to be in panels? Well, so potentially this would do it. And the company in Germany, they make two versions of this. One that has a final absorptive property in the room. So, and that's the sandwich version. So there's foam behind the metal, and then foam in front of the metal. So you don't have this hard reflective surface. But they also make a version where it's just foam behind and a piece of metal in front of it. And then you would have it more reflective in the room if for some reason you wanted that. And I think, in some instances, people will do that. So there is a little bit more ambience in the room. And typically they'd put it not in the places that are sort of in the zone where your ears are. So they would be up higher, in the corners and stuff. So it's absorbing low frequencies, but reflecting some, mid and high frequency energy back into the room, so it doesn't feel like you're in a vacuum. So there is a version of these panels that does that. I didn't go for that. I like a very, very short decay time in my control room. I'm going to tinker with having wood surfaces in the room to bring back a little bit of that. Once all these things are prettied up, I have a plan for putting this wood veneer, panels on top of the tubes and stuff to try and, regain a little bit of reflectiveness in the room. But, when I did the test where I just had one speaker and I built up, piece by piece, the VPR panel behind this, behind the speaker, it did happen where, I did a measurement with nothing, then I put up the 4 inches of foam, did a measurement, there's tiny, minuscule difference, barely any difference at all. Then I put the metal on, and all of a sudden, huge difference. Like now there's like an 8 dB difference in the cancellation that was happening between the wall behind the speaker and the speaker itself. And then I added the front foam. So you're right in that just adding the metal with the foam behind it is the majority of the benefit of the VPR panel. And you put the foam on in front of the metal if you don't want to have your room sound super reflective, sound like a metal room, So if that makes sense. Okay, so then, and I think I talk about this in episode 26. You can see more detail about it. Okay, so then username Colmas asks, what brand of mini split AC unit did you get for the control room? Okay, this is now in episode 25, so apparently it shows up at 45 minutes in. So these are Mitsubishis, and I apologize, I don't have the exact model in front of me. What I got was the Mitsubishi heat pump mini split that is optimized for very, very cold weather. So if you just look for that, you'll see it. And so this thing is able to apparently still generate heat down to like minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's what I have in here. I also, because in Vermont, it'll get that cold at times. And so I also installed just conventional radiant heaters, just like a heating coil, electric radiant heaters. So if there's a time when it goes to like minus 20, which does happen in Vermont, those ones will kick in and make sure that the pipes don't freeze up in this building. So, but if you go for Mitsubishi, super cold weather model, you'll find it. That's what I used. Okay, so now here's a question from Studio Dude 1. What smoothing are you using on your graphs? So I typically use 1/12 for the smoothing while I'm actually making adjustments and evaluating what's happening. That gives me enough detail for me to really see what changes are happening, So if I add just one tube in the room, there's a pretty good chance that I'll actually see a difference that's visible in the graph. There's enough sensitivity to do that. And and I found that higher resolutions than that get so crazy, and you're seeing things. I mean, it looks so terrifying that you don't really know what to do with it because it just looks insane. And then ultimately towards the end, when I start doing EQ moves, I'll switch to 1/6 and smooth things out a little bit, so I'm not trying to do these really carved, surgical moves on my speakers, which is generally not what I want to do. Just do broader things to just kind of even out sections of it. So, and I really got to the point where I could do that now. So 1/12 while I'm working with acoustic treatment of the room, 1/6 when I'm doing the final EQing. Okay, so Half Ton Studios asked, would it not be easier to house the foam and the sheet in a frame? The metal could hang from the frame, and you could have wooden rails to stop the foam moving. It's a good question, and I started out. My first sort of design approach for this was that I was going to build a metal frame for each one, or a wood frame for each one. Had a whole design for it, and then once I did some tests with just putting bolts in the wall, and this room, I skinned the entire interior of this room with 3/4 inch plywood, so I could hang or bolt anywhere on any surface in this room to make all of this a lot easier. And it ultimately appeared, that it would just be easier to not have to do that, not have to build a frame for every one. I mean, there is a lot of these VPR panels in here. There's 6, 10, there's 16, there's like 20 of these things in here. And so that's building 20 wood frames. It's just a lot of work. And when I realized that I could totally make this work just with the bolts in the wall, just hang them on there, done. I was totally happy. And now, what I just showed at the beginning of this, I ended up making a wood frame just to stretch cloth over it to just pretty it up and protect it, because it is kind of vulnerable. If people bump into it, rub into it, or whatever, they can knock off the outer layer of foam and tear the little holes and whatever. So I was able to, so I'm doing that now, but I'm doing it where I'm making a frame that will cover 2 panels. So I only need to make a total of 7 now, because the front ones are covered up by tubes. That was the other thing, is that, a lot of this was going to get covered up by other things. And so it would have been a waste to have this really pretty frame around it if it's just going to get covered up with other stuff anyway. I ended up doing that, but in just 2 separate stages. So there it is. Okay, so now username Ivo Vollering. Thank you, Eric, for this series. You're putting together informative. Here's a question that came to mind. Was a soffit-mounted speaker setup ever an option for you once one of the main cancellations that might occur are due to reflections on the wall behind the speaker? And why didn't you go this path? Thank you. So I've done soffit-mounted speakers before. One that was super successful and one that was super not. So the studio in Northern California that was called Hunk of Shit, HOS recording, that had soffit-mounted speakers, and they just, out of sheer dumb luck, they sounded amazing. They were Yuri 813Cs. They sounded incredible. I've talked about this before. It made me completely naive about room acoustics because that room just happened to sound incredible. And before I had any of the tools or knowledge or anything to measure it and really understand why it worked so well, but something happened in that room and it just sounded wonderful in there. Everybody experienced it when they went in there, and you'd sit down and it was like, whoa, this sounds incredible. And so then when I moved to Barefoot, I was like, okay, I'm gonna take my A13s and I'm gonna just, soffit mount them in the wall and this will sound great. And so super naive, I went through the whole process, built soffits, finished everything. Beautiful birch wood paneling on everything, all super amazing, done. And then turned up the speakers and was like, uh-oh, these don't sound very good. And, I suffered with it for a while, but then I had to tear all of it apart, And so I think the big trade-off, and this is similar to what I was just discussing with the with the control room window, you can build a soffit, basically a wall that is flush with the face of the speakers, and it eliminates that SBIR issue, and it has another effect where it can extend the low frequency response of the speakers. But at that point, I can't. I've now hidden the area behind this wall that all of that air volume I could be using for bass trapping to benefit the whole room gets blocked off, and I can't do that anymore. Because the idea, you know, with a soffit mounted speaker is that it's sealed, you know, at least all the versions that I've seen were really explained that way. And so that, I think, is the potential downside of soffit mounting, is that then you can't use that whole front surface of the room to add bass trapping that benefits the whole room. So that's why I did freestanding speakers, and they are just surrounded with bass trapping. And it's amazing the difference that it makes. Just tightens up the whole room in a really wonderful way. So that's the way I went this time. This room, the dimensions of this room were already designed to lift the low end right where these speakers, you know, start to taper off. And you'll see it in the graph. Like, there's a rise all the way down to 25 hertz or whatever it is there, because the room has a resonance at like 23 hertz, and these speakers start to roll off at 25, and so they sort of pair up there where, you know, there's a lift right where the speakers need it. And the low end and sub in this room is incredible. It is just stunning. You have this really incredible visceral listening experience in here. I just want to make sure I'm not running out of batteries on my recorder there. Okay, so that was my thinking, and so far, so good. It seems to be working for me. Okay, now there's a question from Gayume. Hope I pronounced that right. Okay. You must realize that melamine foam and rock wool mineral wool aren't equivalent. At 4 inches, foam is already declining in absorptive power from 10K. 4 inches of mineral wool will only start declining around 400 hertz. I'm sure you're right about that. You know, I'm just going by what Jürgen Strauss told me to do. He feels very confident. I'm sure he has done plenty of exhaustive testing with his VPR design. I very much trust him. He is one of the most obsessive, you know, thorough human beings I've ever encountered. So I can't argue your point. I'm sure you're right. I'm going by the information I was given, and they did seem to really perform well, you know, in the sort of isolated tests that I did. And so there's something about the interaction between the metal and the melamine foam that seems to do the thing. So there you go. But I'm sure you're right. Okay. So then MCL is asking, you mentioned testing smaller sheets but didn't mention the dimensions of them. Okay. Did this testing go any further than what you showed? It seems like you're stuck with 48 by 36. Yeah, I'm mostly doing 48 by 36 because, you know, I don't have to build as many panels that way, so it's just less work. I would have made them larger, but there was a limitation that the source of the material that I was working with was in 4 by 8 sheets, and so I had to do it in a way where I could, you know, get an efficient amount of each sheet, so there wasn't a lot of waste. It would make things really expensive. And so it was similar with the actual melamine foam. So I designed these so there would be minimal waste and keep the cost down on everything. And that made them consequently a tiny bit smaller than what was actually specified, which was all in metric dimensions, the one that was given to me by Jürgen. So mine's very close, but just a tiny bit smaller. And so then there were a couple places where, you know, the 3 by 4 foot version just wouldn't fit, and so I ended up doing one smaller one there. And then there was supposed to be another smaller one up here, but I ended up having to put a mini split there. So, you know, I've got an extra smaller one that I can put somewhere else maybe. So that was the thing. Okay, was that because you ordered? Was it testing with a smaller? She says, it didn't. Like I mentioned earlier, asking if they were less effective, and it didn't seem to be a huge difference there. I did use thinner metal for those for the smaller ones. It seemed like maybe it would keep the sort of range of absorption in the area where I wanted it, these lower frequencies. But I don't really have any specific proof of that. I did some, very sort of amateur testing of my own, but they seem to be working. So yeah. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay, White Noise Studio. These sheets work sort of like a drum skin, right? Thicker is higher pitch and higher tension as well. Reminds me of plate reverb tuning as well. YouTube's, okay, yeah. You're exactly right. Yeah, it's very similar to a drum skin. Like I said earlier, the stiffer it is, the higher the frequency is going to be. The looser and the more flexible it is, the lower the frequency it is. So the principle is very similar to a drum skin or like the plate in a plate reverb. Totally right about that. I understand that open-celled foam is specified, but do you know if anyone has tested this with standard fiberglass insulation? Similar to what I discussed before, standard fiberglass is not enormously dense, so maybe it would be different there. It might not be as dense as the melamine foam, but I'm sure it would work to some degree. I really can't say if it would be better or worse or whatever. You would have that same issue that I discussed earlier where you don't have this very precise flat surface, so it'd be difficult to get the metal super close without touching. And then hanging it and all that stuff would be a little more complicated just because the melamine foam just holds its form so well. So those are the issues there. But I imagine it would probably work similarly. So, okay, so then Sebastian Tomita asks, have you compared Renz's panel to your DIY panel? I wonder if, I didn't get a chance to do that. It's a good question. I should have done that. Okay, I wonder if the panel can vibrate freely even though there are studs inserted through them. I thought that the metal plate should not be restricted in any way, hence the option chosen by Renz of just using glue. It's a good point. And, when you see my metal panels, there are holes in all four corners, but I don't use all four. I only use 2 holes that are at the top. And the reason I put 4 holes in there is so I could orient them either way, because there was, on the front and back walls, I oriented them more horizontally, and on the side walls, I oriented them more vertically to get the best coverage of the whole surface. So that's why there's 4 holes in there. But, based on how the original design was spec'd out, just having it hanging on pegs, yes, it will restrict a little bit, the vibration of it, but you get the rest of the whole panel that's free to vibrate. And, the way it's done, the holes are oversized compared to the bolts that are going through them. And so there's a tiny, tiny point of contact for each bolt. So it seems to me that it wouldn't be hugely restrictive. The biggest difference would be, because the plate is going to be resonating in 2 different dimensions, or 2 different axes. And so you've got it mounted at the top and it's hanging down. And so in this direction, it will be able to flex the way it normally would. But this dimension, because it's anchored in the corners, would get affected a little bit. And so how that ultimately manifests in the performance of the thing, I don't know, but just going by the design that was sent to me. So there's something to that, I'm sure. Okay, so then username Jimmy Giga asked, your resonant frequencies will likely be higher once you pin the 4 corners. This is a related question, and like I just said, I did not pin all four corners. You know, your instincts are right there. That would have dramatically changed the resonance of the panel, and hopefully just pinning the two retains enough of the low resonance of the panel to have it still be effective. According to the design, that's the case. So, okay, question here from Ant Call. Could aluminum work? I work at an aluminum plant that makes how convenient. That makes plate and coil aluminum I can use to make my own panels. Hey, I'm not an expert with metals, but my understanding is that you know, there's a reason that they make, you know, springs and things like that out of steel. You know, the steel is, I think, has a properties that are better for bending and retaining their form. So they'll vibrate, but they'll stay the way, you know, they'll tend to want to stay in their original form. With steel, and aluminum will, when you bend it, will sort of stay bent more. I'm sure there's an official terminology for what I'm describing there. But I think that would be the problem with aluminum. And I'm also betting that, in general, aluminum is stiffer and more brittle. And so my guess is that its resonant properties would be much, much higher. And it would be harder to get it to resonate as a low frequency. Could be wrong on that. No expert on metals, but that's what my instincts tell me. Because every version of this I've ever seen, they all specify steel. So, okay, so now we're into episode 26. So this question is, I apologize, I accidentally deleted the username. Okay, so the question is, shouldn't you take the spectrum analysis with you in your normal seated listening position? Also, I started wondering, since you're going down the rabbit hole, how about testing the difference with air conditioning on versus off? Boy, this is really down the rabbit hole for sure. So it's an interesting question about how me being in this position affects the frequency response. And my feeling is that, you know, like, the microphone would react differently to me being in this position versus how my ears interact with me being in this position. Because, you know, my perception of sound is based on my ears being mounted in my body in this position. And so that is normal for me. That is my normal sort of perception of acoustic reality, is my ears being mounted in this body. Whereas the microphone is really designed to be a freestanding thing. And as soon as I'm hovering around it or on top of it, it will create, from boundary effects, you know, probably aberrations in the flatness of the microphone. So my guess is that it is different for the microphone than it is for my ears. And so I want the microphone to be listening in the way it was designed to be most accurate, and I want my ears to be listening in the way that they're designed to be most accurate. And I think they're two different things. And so my ears need my body in this position in order for them to give me what I perceive as accurate reality of audio. And the microphone, I think, needs to not have something hovering right around it in order for it to be flat in its response. So that's my best guess there. And then air conditioning on and off, boy, I don't know if that would be a measurable difference. It's an interesting question. You know, if the room is sealed up and you turn on the air conditioning, it could change the overall barometric pressure in the room, maybe, which would potentially change the speed of sound a tiny bit. But boy, that's really grasping there at something that might actually have an effect. I mean, there's the noise floor of it. Maybe that's what you're talking about. That could affect the response that you get. I haven't seen anything like that yet. Fortunately, like in the winter, it's cold. It's cold today. It's like 15 degrees outside. This control room stays beautifully toasty warm with all my, you know, audio equipment. It keeps me nice and warm in here. I don't even have to turn that thing on. No heat at all in here. It's great. So So yeah, so I don't know. I mean, that's really, really going deep there, and there might be something there, but I've never tested for it. And the reality is like, you know, there are going to be times where I have to have that thing on, more so in the summer than in the winter. But yeah, interesting question. Okay, so then next username is MTHDN. I don't know if there's a pronunciation for that. Okay, some questions. I see that you know ATC quite well. How can you compare this sound to the Strauss in general? Okay, so I'll do that one first. So I went down a whole ATC journey, and it was all inspired by Nigel Godrich. I was at a point where I was just done with the 813Cs, and it was like, man, you know, whatever. They've been good to me for a while, but I should probably try and get something that's just a little more, has a little more fidelity than these, because they're really, you know, it's got this blue horn, and they're pretty rough sounding. I got used to them, and you know, a lot of stuff that you probably have listened to of mine, if you're watching this channel, was mixed on those speakers. You know, Good Charlotte, and you know, all the Queen stuff was tracked listening to those speakers. Let's see what else. All the Smash Mouth stuff mixed on 813Cs. So they were certainly effective for a period of time. And then, but you know, I got this wild hair, and I was sort of redoing my control room and changing the console. This is at the same time when I tried getting this Neve 88R console. And so I decided, okay, let's upgrade everything. And so I got ATC speakers. I bought a surround setup of ATC speakers. This was in the early 2000s. It was like, you got to go surround. Everything's going to get delivered in surround now. If you're not mixing in surround, nobody's going to hire you to mix. You know, it's like, oh, okay, I better get surround. Okay. Obviously, that didn't happen. So that ended up being a big waste of money. The only benefit was that I ended up with an oddball third speaker left over, because I sold the ATC 100s that I had, and so I ended up with one left over that was difficult to sell because it wasn't a pair, and so I use that in my chamber now. So I still have one for that. It's been working beautifully for that. So yeah, I put those speakers up. I got them because I had read that Nigel Godrich was using ATC speakers. He obviously makes insanely beautiful recordings, and it's like, man, if they work for him, they must be great. I'll get them, and I'll do great, super beautiful recordings too. That didn't happen for me, so I got those speakers and put them in the room, soffit mounted again in this room. Beautiful, everything finished, all great, wonderful, blah, blah. And all this expense and time went into mounting, and again, turn up speakers. Uh-oh. But in this case, it was a little different. Like when you turn them up, because the speakers just sounded so good unto themselves, I found those speakers to be extremely deceiving. And so I would be mixing in that room going like, wow, this is fucking great. I'm just killing it in here. And take it into another listening environment and go, what is that? What happened? Why does this sound like this in my car? Like, for whatever reason, those things were they were just lying to me like a motherfucker. And so I couldn't get them to work for me. Obviously, tons of people use them. They're a very successful speaker company. People love them. I have a very close friend who's a super desirable, successful mixer, came through Barefoot. He uses ATCs, does great with them. A lot of people do great with them. I could not get them to work for me. So I ended up selling them. They didn't work. So then how they compare. So the primary difference, because I was using 50s and 100s in my setup, those are a three-way speaker versus a two-way speaker. I am way, way, way more into two-way speakers. I think the phasing and just the definition of the listening experience gets way more complicated and confusing when you have sound coming from three different points off the face of the speaker. When you move your head around, it's just a lot more confusing. And so there's that part of it. The sound that's emanating from the speaker is way more cohesive to me with a two-way speaker. And the Strausses they're passive speakers, and so there's not a lot of complicated electronics going into them, and I just find them way more effortless to listen to. They just sound effortless because Jürgen took the time to just choose the components right, mount them correctly, design the right passive crossover so everything, I mean, they're unbelievably flat without a lot of complicated electronics in there. And I think the results sound like that, you know, they just sound really, really just honest and effortless, you know. They're not working hard to make that sound happen. And so consequently for me, they feel way less fatiguing. You know, I remember like when the Dyne Audio first, there was like a near field Dyne Audio speaker that was very popular when they first came out, that were active monitors. It was one of the first rounds of like, oh, active monitors, you don't need a power amp, it's all sort of integrated in the speaker and stuff. I tried those. I found it insanely fatiguing. I couldn't listen to those things all day. There's no way. And so that's sort of the biggest difference for me. Just super flat, honest, effortless sound coming out of these speakers, man. I can't say enough how much I love them. So then there's more stuff here. Okay, respect your DIY adaptation route, but have you any experience with pro acousticians? Why not choose pro project or even some consultation? Why you do not try simple wool traps? Okay, yeah. So so, I mean, I do, in a sense, have professional consultation on this. Jürgen Strauss has been super generous with all of his knowledge and experience guiding me on this. You know, he sent me the design for the VPR panels, and I'm basically following his lead on this of just like, you know, just do the VPR panels all around the room, and you'll do great, you know. And so, and then from there, when I wasn't done with the VPR panels, then I had to sort of start, you know, venture off on my own. And I've hired acousticians in the past, and it's never been a great experience, for me at least. And so I've always ended up in this place where it's wildly expensive. They come in, they take a bunch of measurements, and, you know, like dealing with the acoustics of a room is not something you can just solve in a day. You're dealing with the physics of a room that takes, you know, a lot of effort to really make an impact on what is really happening in that room. So, you know, if like in my case in this room, it's like I have this, you know, 15 dB cancellation at 50 hertz. You cannot in one day introduce an acoustic treatment in the room that's going to solve that problem. It's days of building tube traps and acquiring materials and trying them in the room and moving them around and all this stuff. And, you know, I've never really had an acoustician show up and do that in a day or even in a couple of days in a way that was even remotely close to solving my issues. And so, you know, they would show up and take some measurements, listen to fucking Dark Side of the Moon on the speakers and do a little bit of EQing and go, there you go, what do you think? You know, and you're like, okay, I guess that's good, you know. And it never really was. And so there's that. And on top of it, I would much rather go through this stuff and learn about it, you know. I actually really, really enjoy that experience. And now, for sure, there's tons of amazing information available online. You can search anything, and there's a million versions of how to build these things, and all this data, and all the math, and physics, and everything is, like, available out there. And so, you know, why not just dive in and do it, you know? It's going to be a thing that just, it's a huge investment of time and effort and energy, you know, to really actually go down this road and do it. So I would rather just do it myself. But it's a good question. You know, I guess if I could just pay somebody to show up and do it and be done, then maybe I would do that. But my experience in the past when I've invested the money and haven't come in and do it and sit down and go, yeah, I don't like that. So, and then I would just tear it all apart and do it myself anyways. So I just skipped the first part. Okay. There's a question here from Blue Matrix 5001. What program am I using? It's mostly Fuzz Measure. That's the main graphing software that I'm graphing the frequency response of the speakers in the listening position. But I'm also using at times Room EQ Wizard. That's also been really, really great. They're cool in their own ways. So so then we have Sonic Palace Videos. Great job getting the room pretty darn flat. By the way, Beatles record in Studio 2 at Abbey Road. Pink Floyd record, Dark Side of the Moon, in Studio 3, an amazing room. I was recently at Abbey Road. I'm putting up a video this week about my recording project there. So I had mentioned when I was talking about the big room being similar in dimension to the sound room at Studio 2, I think I had sort of just in passing mentioned that, it's where the Beatles and Pink Floyd and stuff recorded. This gentleman is correcting me. Thank you for this, because it sounds like I got this wrong, that Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon was done in Abbey Road Studio 3, but the Beatles stuff was done in Studio 2. So there's a clarification for everybody, so I'm not spreading misinformation out into the world. Thank you for that. Okay, so then username Orsi, and by the way, we are in episode 26, if I didn't mention it. Okay. Orsi, kind of seems like you are inadvertently making each wall of the room like how an anechoic chamber would work, or possibly having so many curved surfaces of that particular radius disperses the lower frequencies more randomly so they don't converge or cancel in the same spots. So yeah, I mean, ideally in a perfect world, my room would be anechoic in the low frequencies, so all the low frequencies would get absorbed, and then as you transition into the higher frequencies, there would be a short amount of, room decay in sort of like, the mid-range on up. And so that's essentially what I'm trying to do. Obviously, in this room, I can't do it on the floor, although I did end up putting a bunch of tubes on the floor in front of me. So I am actually doing it on the floor a little bit, but I can't totally eliminate the floor in here. But, that would be the perfect room for me. And I did have an initial vision, when I was going to build the crazy perfect studio of all time. I was going to try and do that, like float a room inside an anechoic chamber. And so the floor, you would have like this porous metal on the floor that you could walk on and probably carpet on top of it, but the sound would pass right through with a bunch of bass trapping underneath it and eliminate the floor as well. But it wouldn't work here. Like if you dig down even 2 feet, what you get is water. Here in Vermont, there's a pretty robust water table here in Vermont. So you run into that immediately, and so it would be a swimming pool underneath me. So I couldn't do that, and I had to be sort of more realistic about really what I was going to do in this room. That got a little bit too insane. But that's what I would have loved to have done. But this is getting as close as I can, and you're right. Ultimately, I think when the tubes don't have a hard surface, they're really more absorbing. I don't know that they're redispersing low frequencies in the room in this sort of diffused way. I think they're mostly absorbing low frequency energy in the room, and that's what's really, I think, is the primary benefit of the tubes. But ultimately, I am going to put hard surfaces on a percentage of them in the room to try and, like I said, reclaim some of the decay time in mids and highs, and so we'll all see that later on. But yeah, that's a good question. That would be the dream. Okay, so now username Old Guitars. New Gray Stuff sounds excellent. Great band, production, and vocals. Is there a hi-hat flub on the and of 4 in measure 1 of Mother Road? I'm glad you're back. Yeah, I listened to this, and you're right. Does sound like something. It's a bizarre sound. I'm not 100% sure that it is the hi-hat, because the hi-hat is a softer sound, and there's some sort of bright, clicky sound that is definitely late on the and of 4 in the first bar. And it could be anything in there. I don't know. But, it's more indicative of how that project was, the spirit of how that was recorded. Like, we just put people in the room and hit record, and if it felt great, we call it done. And so there's tons of weird stuff. There's a place in that song, is it in that song? Where the bass player just literally goes to the wrong note, and we just left it in, It doesn't distract me from what how wonderful the song is. And you hear the correction in the moment, but it was a live moment that happened, and he did an amazing job of, going like, oh, and making it sound intentional, but there's definitely a brief moment where there's a wrong note in there. It was just part of the moment, and I love that about that record. I think there are some times when it feels right, and there's so many moments like this in classic records when just the concept of the song, the the vocal performance, the lyrics, like everything is so good that it doesn't matter if there's out of tune notes or out of time notes or somebody hits a wrong note or what. It just flies by in the moment when you're just enjoying this amazing musical expression. And so, and I think there are moments on that Mother Road record that really do achieve that, because Grace's vocal performances are so incredible. Most of those vocals are live, are her singing with the band while she's playing an instrument a lot of the time. And it all seems so much more meaningful. There's just like an authenticity in the way all of that adds up that I think becomes more compelling and is more engaging than if I went back and fixed everything. So that was sort of the spirit of that record, and so I'm sure there's lots of mistakes like that, but you know, you got a good ear. You definitely caught it there. there's something in there that sounds like a hi-hat very off time. Okay, next one is Lovebirds Music. I think I recall from somewhere in this video that the actual diameter of these isn't that much of an important factor. And yes, I've probably said it before, but it's similar to the size and thickness of the metal for the VPRs. The diameter of the tubes will lean the absorptive properties a little bit more towards the lower frequencies or a little bit more towards the higher frequencies. I mean, you can think of it as like a really broadband sort of peak EQ move that's sort of moving lower or moving higher, but it's very broadband with the tube traps. So yeah, that is correct. You know, I do bigger diameter ones, you know, like a 20-inch outside diameter in the corners of the rooms, and I did it on the back wall because, you know, the front to back resonance is very, very low, and I was dealing with this 50 hertz thing. And so the larger diameters were definitely more effective, you know, for that dimension. But, you know, the rest of them are all 12-inch ones, and the 12-inch ones seem to be very effective in the 100 to 200 range, where a lot of the other issues were that I was having. So, okay, so then we have Casper Master has a question. Why wouldn't you do a meter, 3 feet deep, rock wool wall in the back and just be completely done with it? In the front, it makes more sense with these tubes, as it's good with extra efficiency space there, but I feel like a rockwool wall deep enough doesn't take a lot more space and does trap the bass all the way down better than tubes. Okay, so, I mean, I've always heard this thing, it's a really good question, and that was really the approach that I took in the previous studio. So at the Topanga Dice room, which I still do use occasionally, there's 3 walls that are all essentially like that. Relax. Sorry. Max, relax. That are like that. So, and in this case, it's about 2 feet of mineral wool. And in that place, it worked because the walls were thin enough that everything that was really low just kind of went out the building because the walls really weren't thick enough to reflect it. And so it worked, you know, quite effectively in that space, but I didn't really have that luxury here. Like in this room, because that was just a single room studio. It was a control room. I would record in the same space, and so, you know, I didn't have to isolate the sound from a recording space or whatever. So this room I did. So the walls are a lot more substantial, and so they're going to reflect more of the very low frequencies back into this space. Consequently, I have more problems, you know, like I did down at 50 hertz. And so I've always heard this quarter waveform rule for the mineral wool stuff. And so if the quarter waveform rule is accurate, this is this thing that I've heard that you need a quarter the length of the total wavelength of a frequency in order to absorb that frequency with absorptive material like mineral wool. Okay, so in my case, I had, you know, a cancellation at 50 hertz, and the issue that I discovered is that it was an interaction between a resonance in this direction that was around 40 hertz and a resonance in this direction that was around 56 hertz. And they collided right here to cause a cancellation at 50 hertz. And so the wavelength of 40 hertz is 28 feet. That is a long distance. And so, 28 divided by 4 is 7 feet. And so if that's really true, I don't know, thanks, Max. I know, people are here. If that's really true, then I would actually need 7 feet of mineral wool to absorb the frequencies that were really causing the problems in my room. So, if 3 feet would have really done it, and still, like, that's a pretty significant loss of, square footage in my room. If I go every wall with 3 feet, I'm losing 6 feet in this direction and 6 feet in this direction. That shrinks this room by a lot. And it doesn't even get me there. So according to the quarter waveform rule, that would only get me down to 90 hertz, which is about 12 feet. And so that is my understanding. The quarter waveform thing, maybe there's something I don't understand about that and it's not entirely accurate, or it's only in specific circumstances or whatever. But that's what I know. All right. But good question nonetheless. And it was the approach that I took in Topanga. Okay. So then I have Tim Ferrant, 545. Membrane absorbers need to be in front of an airtight cavity to work properly. Just putting a membrane between 2 layers of fluffy stuff like those panels on the walls are not going to work. Okay. I think we're talking about 2 different things here. A membrane absorber, I built something I think that sounds more similar to what you're describing. In my case, it was a limp mass membrane absorber, which did nothing in this room. It was extremely ineffective. I may have screwed it up, whatever. I think I did it, accurately to the design that I found, but yeah, it didn't work for me. And then that case, yes, it needs to be an airtight sealed thing, and then the depth of the cavity behind it with absorptive material inside sort of determines the resonance of it. That's, combined with the thickness or the mass of the material that's in the front. That was the version that I did with a membrane absorber. But these are different than that. These are VPR panels, and if you look at episode 25, when I did the test with a single speaker and built the thing up and took measurements along the way, it really did something very, very, very measurable. So I think I was able to actually prove that it was doing something, and it's definitely a well-established approach for doing this. That's different than a membrane absorber. But you're totally right. A membrane absorber does need to be a sealed thing. Okay. So then, username none given 9528. Did you try maximizing speaker position first? I definitely did. So the one positioning aspect that I knew I was going to do was that I was going to push the speakers as close to the back wall as possible. I wanted as much of that low frequency, enhancement as I could get, because the dimensions of the room and the design of the speaker were really actually chosen to complement each other. And you'll see it in the graph, the low frequencies rise up to like 23 or 25 hertz, so that part really worked great. And so then it was really just a question of how wide they should be, and then where I should sit in relation to them. And I experimented with it a bunch. Really, once all the VPR panels were up, that's when I did the experiment. And so for me, the width is a big deal. So the wider the speakers are, obviously, the wider the image is, and the whole sound just kind of wraps around you more, and it's pretty wonderful. But there's a point where when you get too wide that they lose punch and focus. And so I played with that until I felt like I had a good balance of both of them. I could turn it up and really feel the impact of the kick drum very clearly. It wasn't being sort of splayed apart between the speakers, and but still have this really cool, wide presentation of the sound, where the sound really kind of wraps around you. And then I've just played with my position. So, one of the issues that I can have with large format speaker, large monitors, is that they can become, very unintimate. So, I don't have that sort of immediacy of sound. And so, I try to get close enough. And I'm in a position here where when I really need to hear something, I can lean forward just a little bit and things get really, really super detailed. And then I can lean back a little bit and it's a little more diffused sounding. So I'm kind of like right in that sort of transition where I'm sitting. And it's been feeling great. But I really did do that. And I also looked at graphs of different positions to try and get my head in a place where it was, I wasn't inviting unwanted problems in the frequency response. And so I played with that. I think initially I was a little further back overall, and then after playing with positions, graphing it, I ended up a little bit closer. But yeah, I did experiment with that. Okay, so then George G85 asking, have you ever tried experimenting with filling the tubes with low density insulation like another company's tubes? They claim that through isothermal properties, they're able to achieve better absorption at lower frequencies that way compared to a tube with no stuffing of the same size. So they're saying there's a benefit. I did experiment with that. I did it with mineral wool, and maybe that was a mistake because you're saying low density insulation. I would consider mineral wool to be more high density. And so when I put mineral wool, I bought enough to fill 3 of these tubes in the back of the room with mineral wool insulation, filled them in bats top to bottom, and graphed before I did it, graphed afterwards, no difference. So if it doesn't make a difference, I'm not going to waste my time and money doing it. But I may have screwed that up. It sounds like maybe lower density stuff would have been more beneficial. Certainly would have been easier to put inside there. Getting the mineral wool inside the tubes was not particularly easy. But I think I ended up leaving it in there. Like, it didn't make any difference. So I left it in there for 1 or 2 of them or something. I don't know. I don't remember. But, it's all working now. Okay, so then Infininique is the username here. You answered so many questions I've had. One thing I thought was that your sweep was quite short, only 5 seconds. I would have gone a lot longer, give problem frequencies time to get ringing to replicate sustained bass notes. It's a really good question. I've experimented with that at times, anywhere from 1 second to 10 seconds. And when I've done, like, if that was an issue, so if you need these frequencies to sustain longer in the room to really see the problems that they have, then the graph would look different if I did it at 1 second versus 10 seconds. And it didn't. And so I just sort of split the difference at 5 seconds. I would be happy to do it at 10 seconds if it really looked different. But every time I've compared it with the software I'm using, it didn't really show a difference in the frequency response in the room. So at least with the way I'm doing it, it hasn't been a factor. And so I've stuck with 5 seconds. It seems to be long enough. I could probably do 1 second sweeps because they didn't really look different either. But just to be safe, I'm doing 5 second sweeps. But it's a good question. Yeah, there might be something I'm missing there, but so far seems like 5 seconds will give me all the information I need. Okay, so we got Bobby Jones, AAB. How do you feel the tube traps relate to the false wall build you did at Topanga Canyon? If room allows, is there a big difference between 20 tubes, 8 tubes, any experience with filling the interior tubes? Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff I've already answered in this round of stuff. Yeah, bigger tubes will absorb lower frequencies. It's a very broad band. My experience with filling the tubes with mineral wool did not make a difference, but I may have screwed that up. And I was recently in the Topanga room again, and the room is generally good. It didn't have like the really dramatic issues that I had in here after putting up the the VPRs, I think mostly because the walls were so thin that a lot of that low frequency information was just leaving the room. But ultimately, when I was back in that room, I could tell, like, this room would benefit from some tubes for sure. And if I get serious about being in that room again, which may happen in the future, I'm definitely going to put some tubes in there. So yeah, the tubes still for me are really a great. It's the solution. They're just dummy proof. They're so easy to build, and they really get results, measurable results, and results that I hear and feel in my listening position. So I'm still an advocate of the tubes. Okay, could you cover the tube traps with fabric to make them more aesthetically appealing, or would it ruin the effect they have acoustically? That's what I'm doing right now. I showed it at the beginning, but you can see behind me, I'm in the process of covering all these tubes. I use a stretchy fabric. There's stuff that I found on the Acoustamac website. It is the, what do they call it here? The DMD fabric on there. It seems not wildly expensive, and it's been working great. It's super stretchy, which makes it easy to put them on. And, you just sew it into a big sock that's a slightly smaller circumference than the tube itself. So you have to stretch it a little bit, and then it just holds itself on the tube. Super easy. So that's how all of these are done. I still have a bunch to go. I'm trying to get help from somebody to help sew stuff while I'm building panels, just to make this go faster. Words cannot express how much I want this construction to be done at this point. I'm super duper duper over it. Just trying to hold on to every last remaining bit of my patience and determination to get through this. But my God, I'm ready to be done with this. Okay, so but yeah, and no, the fabric does not affect the performance of it. I've done these tubes with the paper on the outside, without the paper. There's maybe a tiny measurable difference, but it's really not significant. I'm going to end up leaving the paper on these because it's easier to slip the fabric over it, and it's just sort of a smoother surface. They end up kind of looking a little better. They don't seem to be particularly picky about that stuff. They work either way. So. So I know your original plan was to just stack tube traps all around the room. Do you wish you went with that plan? So I'm going to do a next episode because I did a final experiment to test that, and so but I don't want to give it away here, but I did a final comparison, like what if I just went with tubes versus VPR. And you'll see all the results of that. It was interesting. So, because I just, it only took me one more day, and I convinced the company that I get the tubes from, can I just take a bunch of tubes, do an experiment? If I don't need them, I can bring them back. And they let me do it. They were super cool about it. I'm the crazy person that's been in there buying tubes for some bizarre reason that they don't understand. Because everybody else that comes in there is building air conditioning systems, Okay, so. Do you wish you went with that plan? I feel like there are benefits of the tube traps, like the VPR, the limp mass membrane. Okay, yeah, so I determined for me, with the rest of the question, the limp mass thing didn't work for me. VPRs, ultimately, there is still a benefit there that I'm keeping involved. And the Helmholtz is working. I have Helmholtz in 4 positions that really, really made a difference with the 50 hertz thing, because they're so targeted, they're so focused. That was the most severe cancellation that I had, and the Helmholtz is really, really great when you have just like, this horrible cancellation. When you finally get them tuned to the right frequency in the right place in the room, man, they are pretty impressive. So those are important. Okay, so no hard shell on the inside of the tube trap. That seems like an interesting departure from what's out there. I've seen some bits about that. I haven't had a chance to test it, so I can't really say. And I've seen ones like that, but these things have worked well enough for me without having to insert a hard shell thing on the inside. Maybe I'm missing a huge amount of benefit because of it. But they seem to be working great for me, so I'm sticking with it because they're so easy. You just buy the tube and you put it in the room. I love the simplicity of that, and it got me there, so I'm happy. I have one more thing that I might do at one point. I may try and build what is a hybrid between it's both the tube trap and a VPR. I'm very, very curious to see if that could actually be a thing, because then you would get the best of both. So that'll happen down the tube. I am out of patience with this. The room sounds great. I cannot fucking deal with this anymore. I want to fucking make some goddamn music. So maybe down the road I'll try that experiment. Okay. Okay, so this is now rocks and roll. Can you solve all this problem building up an anechoic room? I talked about that. Yes, that would be my perfect scenario, be an anechoic room with a little bit of, decay time in the mids and higher frequencies. Okay, did anyone notice the massive dent in the right channel Strauss's woofer? Okay, there's been a few questions about this. It's time that I actually explain what happened there. Yes, this happened a while ago. Very sad. I've experimented with some things. A bunch of people have offered ways to try and resolve that. Thank you for all the suggestions. I've tried all of them. None of them have worked. The material that's used for that comb is quite stiff. It's been very difficult to try and just pop that thing back out. The thing that's been the closest was using a vacuum, really high-powered vacuum cleaner, trying to pull that thing out. Didn't work. So I think I may try one more thing. There's one other way to do it where you can mechanically do it by poking a tiny little hole in there with like a little piece of steel wire or something and using that as a hook to sort of physically just pull it out. So I may try that. Ultimately, it's not supposed to really affect the sound of the speaker. It's just a dust cover. It's just to keep dust out of the driver. So it still sounds great. I talked to Jurgen about it. He said, it won't ruin the sound of the speaker, but he's definitely bummed, that the speaker looked like it got punched in the face. Which is exactly what happened. So what happened was I had set these speakers up in the basement of our house initially. They showed up at the house. I was still trying to finish the Mother Road record. I'd done an initial round of mixing in Topanga. Then it was time to come back here. I didn't really have a mixing place set up here in Vermont. This place was still a construction zone. So I set up a temporary mixing place in the basement of our house with these speakers because I finally had these. I was like, I want to use these. Set them up in the basement. So they're set up down there, did some mixing. Then they were just hanging out down there. There was a day I was at home. All of our laundry is in the basement. Our washing machine and dryer is in the basement. So I was doing some laundry. My son, Sagan, follows me pretty much everywhere. And so I went down to turn some laundry over. So I was down there pulling laundry out of the washing machine, putting in the dryer. Boop, boop, boop. I hear this thumping sound in the distance in the basement. I turn to my right and see my son punching the dust cone in of the Strauss motor. And I went, ah! And ran over there. It was like, no! It was the ultimate test of my parental patience and understanding, for sure. To say those speakers are expensive is the understatement of the decade. But, it happened. What are you going to do? I was totally heartbroken, I never even got to have them in their final place in a finished room looking finished, But whatever, they still sound great, I'll probably replace it at some point, just for more for Jurgen's benefit. I generally don't care, but I only care if it sounds good. But I want his speakers to be represented well here, because I may have people come and listen to these speakers, have this be a showcase for them, because I think they really do sound extraordinary in this room. So there you go. That's the story. That's the heartbreaking story of the dust cover on my speaker. I mean, it is kind of irresistible. I can't argue with the desire to punch it in. I mean, when I look at it, I want to punch them in. It just looks like a thing that needs to be punched. But I certainly wish it hadn't been. Okay, another question from Angelo Boltini. Okay, has anyone A/B tube traps with just big rectangular gobos? This seems like, okay, this is similar to some of the other stuff that we've talked about. It relates to the quarter waveform rule. There is something about the form of the tube traps that I think increases their efficiency in absorbing low frequencies. So the net result is you get absorption at lower frequencies with less depth than you would just using, stacks of absorptive material. Because of the shape of it. That seems to be my experience. That seems to be the general understanding. So I don't have proof of it. When I talked to the company ASC on the phone, as much as they were willing to share with me, they said essentially that there is things about the shape. It creates some sort of pressure gradient or something like that increases the efficiency of absorbing low frequency. So there you go. So I think that's why, yeah. Okay, then there's a question about plans of having a console in here. Okay, yeah, I mean, if I was going to put in a console, the only one I'd put in would be an undertone console. But I've moved past that. This whole thing of recording stuff is really a journey for me. I will never just do the same thing forever. The Undertone console was an amazing experience and just a cool opportunity to really conceptualize and build what would be the most amazing analog console ever. And I really think we achieved that, at least for what I want out of a console. And that console also had that non-reflective porous surface and made huge strides to really reduce the impact of the console on the acoustics of the speaker in the room, which is pretty catastrophic. I don't know if you've ever really measured that. If you've got a console in your room, it sucks, the mid-range is destroyed for your near-field monitors. And, it just looks like this, from 1K to 5K. It's kind of a disaster. It's a very important, area. And so yeah, I'm over it. I don't want to have a big console in front of me anymore. Even my rack of EQs, I can tuck into a little soffit and this thing will go away. And I have this completely unobstructive listening path, except for this tiny little table and this little monitor that I've really optimized. I put down really low out of the listening field, and it makes a huge difference, man. These speakers just sound unbelievably gorgeous. And so I'm not going to, so for that reason, I don't want to have a big, huge console in here. It just takes up too much space. And it's really hard to justify just what the console brings to the process. Having duplicates of the same channel isn't really exactly what I need anymore. I like the summing, and so that's why way back in Topanga, I designed the custom passive summing mixer. So I built the initial one myself, just in the basement of my house, and it's a 16-channel, 4 stereo bus, passive summing mixer, and that ultimately turned into the Undertone Audio Pure Sum product, which it evolved a little bit. It's a 32 input version of it, but still has 4 stereo buses. And I love that thing. I love this approach to having summing and having a console. It gives me everything that I ever needed from a large console, which is mostly just the summing, so I can use all of my outboard gear in a way where I don't have to deal with the sort of latency and additional conversions and all of that stuff that's associated with doing hardware inserts. There are times where that gets kind of complicated and difficult to manage for me, at least. And so I love being able to just go out of the computer, and I know it's going to go out in time and have all of these other things that relate to it, whether it's parallel compression or whatever, that just go out and do that thing. And I don't have to worry about everything staying perfectly phase accurate. It will stay that way out in the real world. And so the other benefit that I love about the passive summing mixer is because I can turn it into all these different types of, mixers. The Undertone is a beautiful sounding console. It is only one sound, and I'm doing lots of different sounds. There are some things that I really want to sound like an authentic 50s recording. And so I can make that Pure Sum thing sound like a 50s RCA tube console. If I use the RCA console to make up the gain, I use those preamps for all the summing stages, it fucking sounds like that console. It's really cool, because the RCA console, it's just a passive summing network going into these tube gain stages to make up the gain, And so It's no different with the pure sum thing. So it can sound like an old RCA tube console. It can sound like an undertone console because I'll use MPDI4s. I can sound like a Neve console with Neve preamps. I can sound like an API console. I can do all those things. And in a 1 RU rack unit, you know, and so I'm not going back, you know. I will definitely be mixing this way until I come up with my next cockamamie plan, you know, in my journey. So yeah, no console here. Okay, so okay, what's the difference in performance? Okay, this is from Soulflower again, 8687. What's the difference in performance of the tube traps between empty tube traps and traps filled with? Okay, I'm just gonna skip that. I already done it. Okay, just out of curiosity, okay, this is now from Conrad C4599. Just out of curiosity, did you end up using the PCB or concrete tube for your final Helmholtz design? I ended up going with the concrete tube. It was not a big enough difference with the hard plastic one, which was really heavy. It was like 50 pounds. And so it would have been harder to mount it up there, and it wasn't a night and day difference. Like if I was getting like twice the difference in the, you know, in how it was impacting the cancellation in the room, then I would have done it, but it just wasn't that. So once I managed to like get it up into position, and it was really hard because it was so heavy and all that stuff, ultimately it was doing basically the same thing. So didn't need to do it. It was also kind of expensive. So yeah, it was stuck with the hard sort of cardboard concrete forms. Okay, so then Matthew W. Nadolski 6692 ask if you present. This is about Max. If you present another ball, he will drop the one he has. Also feed him stuff. Okay, recommendation about the diet. I considered that. It's a good suggestion. Here was the issue. So I need to get him to drop the ball when we go inside, so he won't have a ball inside, because he'll never stop dropping it at your feet to get you to try and play fetch inside, which is, you know, he won't relax and just lay down and rest at that point. He's just so obsessed with it. And so I can give him another ball. Yeah, maybe you're saying only present it and he'll drop it. But if I give him another ball, then I have the same problem. You know, he would bring that ball inside. But yeah, maybe I just show it to him. He'll drop that one. I can grab it and he'll go inside. But this is what has worked is when I'm playing fetch with him outside, I use one of those chuck it sticks. And I'll throw the ball. And if you time it just right, because he will always drop the ball automatically. He does that. He's already learned that behavior. And so every time I've learned, you know, when he's about to do that. And so right when it's about to come out of his mouth, I say the same word. I go, drop it every time. And he's just learned that sound comes right when the mouth comes out of his mouth, and or right when the ball comes out of his mouth. And it's totally worked, you know. So when he runs up to the door and I go, drop it, it just goes, it just pops out of his mouth. Like, I think he doesn't even realize it. It's super funny. But, you know, I've done that probably over 100 times while we're playing fetch. Every time he runs up, I say, drop it, right when the ball comes out of his mouth. So that actually kind of worked. Okay. So Mr. Akatinka asked, have you thought about using a trade-off for the final equalization? Use it. It sounds amazing. Okay, I've addressed this. I'll say it again quickly. I own one. I used it in Topanga. It was sort of like a great finishing off of the monitoring in there. They do sound really cool. In this setup, I was determined to get the really just natural sound of these Strauss speakers. And I feel like I've really got there, especially in this very, very last round of tweaking that you'll all get to check out. The Trinoff is amazing. It really is. And the thing that makes me nervous about it is, like, there is some very heavy-handed stuff going on in there. And I'm sure it all makes sense But it's a lot of really intense digital processing and filtering and phase shifting and stuff that's going on in there. I'm sure there's good reasons for all of it. But there's something inside me that is just has a hesitation about that. Do I really want all of that going on my speakers? I mean, in Topanga, it worked. It was very satisfying sounding. So, whatever my misgivings are, I overcame them and I used it in Topanga, and I'm happy that I did. But here, I want to use these speakers the way they were designed, and I don't want to put all of this intense digital processing on the signal going to these speakers. I just can't, there's something about that just doesn't feel right for me. And the other issue that I had at the time, and I think they've probably resolved this by now, but the latency was definitely a problem. Because I was in a situation where I was just tracking in my control room all the time. And so if I wanted to just grab an instrument and play something really quick, I had to bypass that thing while I was playing, because the latency was made it impossible. They've been super cool. They've reached out at times. I think they've heard me talk about that, and they've said, "Hey, there's ways to optimize that." I'm sure they've addressed it, and it probably performs much better now. I haven't used it for years, so. But that was my issue there. That's sort of my thinking on it now. It's still a great box. I may use it if I set up another room in here where I don't have the luxury of doing all this acoustic treatment. I'll probably set it up in another room that's just for mixing or editing or whatever. It's a really cool box. Okay, so I got two more, and then we'll be able to stop in this round because we'll be all the way up to episode 27. We're almost caught up here. Okay, and so look up limp bag membrane traps. They did a great job in my studio in smoothing out the lows. Very easy to make. I did look at those, and I just didn't. By the time they got mentioned and I looked at them, I was already sort of too far down these paths. I didn't have a chance to try them, but they look cool, and yeah, it looks easy to make, and it may have been a better way to go. I wish I'd heard about them earlier. I could have included that in all the experimentation, but. It's sort of that moment passed. Okay, so then the last thing here we'll do in this round is, where are you typically purchasing your materials for tube traps? Home Depot or Lowe's? And unfortunately, no, they're not really available there. I've seen them listed on the website, but it's like a special order thing. And so the only place that I was able to get this here was a place called Homan's in Vermont, and it'll probably be different in whatever area that you're in. Because it's typically a place that is supplying materials for air conditioning installers, because these tubes are used to insulate big tube, air conditioning ducts and stuff like that. It's a big issue here in Vermont because the temperature swings are so extreme here. But here, I'll show you the place. If maybe there's places all over the country. I don't know. They're certainly all over the East Coast. Yeah, it looks like it's really just the Northeast is where Homan's is. But this is what it looks like. It's a trusted HVAC brand. So clearly this is a place that just supplies for air conditioning installers. And so that's what you got to look for. It's more of like a business to business type supplier that supplies for this type of work. And they'll have tons of them. They're not wildly expensive. And the ones that I get are the John Mansville brand. I think Dow Corning makes them as well, but I've mostly used the John Mansville one. So that's what to look for. I'm sure you'll find one in your area. So there you go. We're up to episode 27 with questions and comments. Thank you again. Always such amazing, awesome, thoughtful questions and comments. I really appreciate everybody checking this stuff out and really digging in and thinking about it, and and challenging me to question what I'm doing. At times there's always room for improvement. So I love all the questions. So I'm going to leave it here, and I think the next episode will be something about doing all of the final prettying up of this stuff, and my last little bit, my one last experiment. I'll do that as soon as I can. It's crazy busy trying to finish this stuff, and I have music projects and other things and undertone. There's so much going on. So I apologize. I haven't really been able to keep up with a consistent flow of episodes, but I'm back home. I'm in Vermont. I should be able to get some more going. So I will see you again on the next one. All right. Thanks for watching. Bye.